G'day guys and gal. A lot of you legends seem to like my which loyalist Primarch was the most useless during the Horus Heresy video, so I thought why not do the traitors now, as they had just as much interesting lore as the loyalists did. Lore that clearly shows who was doing the heavy lifting and who was getting carried hard. Something I love about Warhammer is that it isn't afraid to be like, while every faction and main character has their strengths, that doesn't mean every fight has to be a draw or everyone has to contribute equally. Some Traitor Legions were obscenely effective during the Heresy, others sucked more balls than me and Khalifa. Today we determine who was who. Before we get started, the Fountain of Youth may be out of our reach at the moment, but that doesn't mean we can't do some basic easy stuff to make us look fresher and hotter for longer. The best and easiest way to do this is using skincare, notably from Geology. Geology knows that getting into new things like skincare can be a nightmare for us blokes, especially if we don't have sisters or girlfriends, which I assume most of us don't since we like Warhammer. We don't know how or when to cleanse, what creams to use in the morning, what creams to use at night, what the hell is an exfoliator. So Geology simply asks us to fill out a quick survey and bam, you get a custom skincare routine delivered to your door. My morning cream has sunscreen in it due to Australia's lack of ozone layer situation, and my night cream has retinol in it to reduce acne, redness, and fine lines. The ingredients of Geology products are legit. I have gal friends asking me to get them free Geology all the time because their formulations are elite. After all, they have won 42 awards and counting. I've been using Geology for years and the results speak for themselves. I'm no longer oily, my skin complexion is more even, and even my under eye bags have reduced. I look better now than I did when I was 21. Geology also has a range of nice smelling natural hygiene products like shampoos, deodorants, and body washes. So to get 70% off your first skincare package and an additional 50% off another product of your choice, as well as a free gift. What a deal. Then use my link, QR code on screen, or code Majorkill70. Cheers to Geology for sponsoring this video. Today we'll go over what each Traitor Legion did during the Horus Heresy to determine who was the most useless, i.e. which Traitor Legion we could have removed entirely in order to have the least amount of impact on the overall result of the Heresy. Let's get into it. Going in chronological order, that gives us the Emperor's Children first, led by Fulgrim. This one is complicated. Fulgrim was Horus's greatest asset at the start of the Heresy. The Emperor's Children fought hard. Fulgrim lured and then slew Ferrus Manus, who was considered one of the greatest loyalist Primarchs, at the start of the Heresy. However, after Isstvan, Fulgrim became a huge liability. He led Perturabo on a side quest that injured both of their legions. Also, Fulgrim could ascend to become a demon prince, nearly killing Perturabo in the process. Fulgrim then fucked off to go have orgies in the webway, allowing his legion to fracture into dozens of warbands that often killed each other. Sure, Eidolon managed to whip about a third of the legion into shape and helped Mortarion corner the White Scars, but the White Scars gave them the slip and killed a ton of them in the process. Fulgrim was dragged kicking and screaming back into the Heresy by Lorgar and forced to deploy on Terra, where he attacked a fortified position, lost thousands of warriors, got his ass beat by Dawn, and then said fuck this and abandoned the siege of Terra, preferring to torment and slaughter the innocents of the planet instead. Sure, the Emperor's Children did end up slowing down Alanius, John, and their band of merry men from reaching the Emperor, but they didn't stop them. So whilst Fulgrim started off strong with a Primarch kill, his legion's extreme selfishness ended up making him near useless at best and a liability at worst. Now we have Perturabo and his Iron Warriors. When the Heresy began, Perty saw it as a normal war, put pressure on the loyalists, tipped the balance in the traitors' favour, and forced the Emperor to surrender. He never thought it'd become this fucked up war of gods and demons, nor did he want it to be. Perty was extremely effective during these Legion wars, when demons weren't much of a factor yet, or at least in war zones where he was. Sure, there was some early setbacks, such as Fulgrim trying to assassinate him, the Battle of Talon, as well as the Battle of Fal, setbacks that hardened Perturabo into furious iron. However, he truly would shine during the Siege of Terra itself. He was given overall command and was the only one that could match Dawn's brilliance for siege. Every inch of ground taken was thanks to Perturabo's calculated genius, as well as the strength of his legion. He saw the siege as a game between himself and Dawn, a game he was slowly winning. However, when Perty had done enough damage to allow mass legions of demons to materialize on Terra, Horus removed him from command and put Mortarion in command instead. The time for tactics and legion wars were over, the time for hectic chaos warp spaghetti fuckery had begun. Perturabo was so insulted by his removal and so disgusted with the Traitor Legions embracing the warp that he withdrew himself and nearly his entire legion from the siege, ending their involvement in the Heresy. It's actually wild reading the lore during this. The siege goes from brilliant strategies and ploys and counter strategies, like a hectic mind game between Perturabo and Dawn, to then just becoming a chaotic fuckfest. The traitors just Leroy Jenkinsing at the loyalist positions, only making ground due to sheer numbers and sorcery. It becomes extremely apparent when Perturabo leaves and Mortarion takes over. Something else Perty did which was pretty cool was finding Angron, beating him into submission, Legion, and then dragging him back to the traitors' cause. Perty had his moment to shine, shined, and then was snuffed out. Conrad and his Night Lords weren't even really present during the Siege of Terra, the small force they did send getting annihilated by the Blood Angels early on. But does that make them useless? The Night Lords had 3 moments to shine. The first was delaying the Dark Angels during the Thramis Crusade, keeping the Lion and his Legion out of action. Yes, this did end up with the Night Lords getting fucked on and their Legion being sundered, but they still tied up the Dark Angels for a while. The second moment was Conrad terrorizing Macragge, causing a lot of issues, distracting Guilliman and the Lion, and nearly killing them, as well as driving a wedge between the brothers' faith in each other. But nothing really ever came of this. Thirdly, a large force of Night Lords attacked Sotha, managing to deactivate the Pharos device and more or less end Imperium Secundus. However, both of those moments actually pushed the Loyalists to rush to Terra, allowing Sanguinius to stand on the throne world, so it kinda ended up helping the Loyalists, at the cost of most of the Night Lord Legion being killed. How about the Angry Boy and his Angry Boys, Angron and the World Eaters? The World Eaters are a force to be reckoned with. Despite their spazziness, they were actually quite useful to the traitors. They took part in the Shadow Crusade, burning Ultramarine, helping create the Ruinstorm. Sure, Angron fucked off for a bit after that, and when he was brought back by Perty, had to be imprisoned until the time was right due to his instability and rampages he went on while on his own flagship, but when Angron reached Terra, he was a monster, ripping through defenses without pause and being utterly unkillable. The World Eaters were relentless. The only thing keeping them back was walls and Angron's inability to get through the Emperor's psychic shielding. Khan by himself was also a juggernaut, killing many, including a number of named Imperial heroes. It was only at the peak of the siege, when most of the damage had already been done, that Sigismund slew Khan and Sanguinius slew Angron, removing the World Eaters as a major threat. Not to mention also their horrendous casualties from always throwing themselves first at the enemy. The World Eaters didn't have a particular moment to shine like Perturabo did. More so, they were just this constant force and pressure, nothing if not consistent. Mortarion was an absolute menace to deal with. He was with Horus from nearly day 1 of the Heresy, was essential in the war for Molech, harried the Khan and boxed him into a corner, with the White Scars only escaping due to an extremely clutch desperate move. For his efforts during the Heresy, Horus promised Mortarion that the Death Guard would be the first force on Terra, a promise he kept. Mortarion's forces were extremely difficult to deal with. Not only were the Plague Marines extremely durable, but they had this pestilent aura, with countless guardsmen and defenders dying from unnatural plagues and diseases. They had roughly a similar impact in the siege as the World Eaters did. That was until Mortarion took over, then things got hairy for the defenders. Mortarion had concocted this spiritual plague of despair. It was so powerful that Imperial morale plunged, with thousands killing themselves, each other, or just going insane. It was so powerful that it even affected Space Marines and Rogel Dawn himself. Dawn reflected that he felt himself on the edge of a mental breakdown, and that he had to put considerable will into making sure he didn't give off physical signs of wanting to give up. This despair plague was present for a number of books, and no one knew what to do about it, except Jagadai Khan, who sacrificed himself to take out the Death Lord, ending the plague and restoring a lot of loyalist morale. Typhus then took a large force of Death Guard and assaulted the Astronomicon, engaging in intense battle with Corswain and his Dark Angels. The Death Guard were disciplined, cohesive, and powerful, one of the most reliable out of all the Traitor Legions and heavily favoured by Horus. Magnus and his Legion, but mostly Magnus, were quite the asset for the traitors during the Heresy. Firstly, Magnus broke the Emperor's wards, thus ruined his Webway project, saving chaos, costing nearly the entire Custodian Guard's lives, and confining the Emperor to the Golden Throne for nearly the entire Heresy. After that, the Thousand Sons kinda sat and watched from the sidelines, doing their own little side quests before Magnus then arrived at Terra for the siege. However, this was for his own selfish reasons. He was using the siege as a cover to infiltrate the palace and recover his final shard, his noble shard. The Emperor allowed this to happen as it gave him a chance to try turn Magnus back to the Loyalist cause. However, Magnus proceeded to kill Malcador and then tried to kill the Emperor, forcing Vulcan to beat him into submission, at which point Magnus then became a demon and was banished from the palace due to the Emperor's wards. His Legion itself wasn't able to achieve too much. They were foiled by the White Scar Stormseers, didn't have the numbers, and also didn't give a fuck about the traitor's cause, so they weren't really willing to die for it. However, Magnus entered the Webway and began a ritual to drain the Emperor's power, forcing Vulcan to also enter the Webway and fight his brother, a fight that ended with Vulcan pulverizing Magnus' skull and banishing him, more or less ending the Thousand Sons' direct involvement in the Heresy. Obviously, Horus was quite the asset for the traitors during the Horus Heresy. He kicked things off, formulated the opening strategies for the traitors, which saw the Loyalist forces devastated and the traitors gain a huge upper hand. He got most of the Mechanicum on his side, led the conquest of Molech, smashed Lehman and his wolves, and was overall a bit of a beast. However, when Lehman wounded Horus, Horus started slipping in and out of a coma, spending a lot of time in the warp, overall quite distracted, and it took a lot of effort and sacrifice for him to recover. He then won the battle for Beta Garmin and pushed his forces to Terra. Now, Horus was too busy mocking the Emperor in the warp to personally lead the invasion, so he allowed Perturabo to take command for phase 1 of the siege. Then when Terra was warpy enough, he allowed Mortaran to take over and lead. Funnily enough, Horus didn't even put a foot on Terra during the entire siege. His sons however did and put in a big shift. However, they were baited by the Saturnine Gambit, which saw pretty much the entire Sons of Horus command structure, including the Mournival, slaughtered, with only Abaddon surviving, and that was barely. So without any commanders or their Primarch, many Sons of Horus warriors just ran around in loose warbands, attacking whatever they wanted without much direction. They sort of just became a bit irrelevant for a couple books. Legio Mortis, the personal Titan Legion of Horus, did not become irrelevant however. They smashed through the Loyalist final Titan Legion and breached the Mercury Wall, opening up the inner palace and beginning the final stages of the siege. Horus then proceeded to kill Sanguinius and mortally wound his father before being slain himself. Overall, the man put in a shift. Lorgar and his wordbearers were an interesting one. They were technically the true architects of the Heresy, being the first to fall and Erebus directly causing Horus to fall. The wordbearers then devastated the Ultramarines on Calth and then went on to help create the Ruin Storm, a warp storm that more or less stopped Terra from getting the reinforcements it needed. Lorgar then brought Fulgrim and the Emperor's children back to the Traitors' cause, however here is where he shits the bed. Lorgar believed that Horus was a shitty war master and that instead he should take over, hence he attempted to usurp Horus and got beaten into submission for his efforts, getting banished from the Heresy. A few thousand wordbearers, led by Zardu Layak, went with Horus to the siege of Terra, however Layak was slain by Rogal Dawn and his wordbearer forces are barely mentioned. So whilst the wordbearers did a lot of heavy lifting early in the Heresy, they more or less weren't even a part of the second half of it. And finally, Alpharis Omegan. This is probably the most interesting. These guys were everywhere and did a lot of shit, but have you ever heard the term busy idiot? They trapped the White Scars in the Chondak system using a hidden base that would project a mini warp storm, but then Omegan sent an Alpha Legion team to destroy the base, freeing the White Scars. They also attacked the Space Wolves after Prospero, but the Sons of Rust escaped. Then they attacked Pluto, but were outplayed by Rogal Dawn, who killed Alpharis in a duel, causing Omegan to withdraw the entire Legion from the Heresy due to his likely loyalist nature. The Alpha Legion were a lot of bark and not much bite, plus two of the Hydra heads were biting at each other the entire time. So from this, who was the most useless? Well, Horus, Mortarion, Perturabo, and Lorgar certainly weren't. These Primarchs and their legions were either the architects or backbones of the Heresy and its war effort. Angron and his legion are also safe, they were just such a force. Magnus was also safe, as despite his low siege impact and sitting on the fence most of the time, the damage he did to the Webway project was the only reason the Traitors stood a chance. Fulgrim was a spaz and did sabotage the Traitors in some ways, however he killed Ferrus Manus, was present during the siege, and his legion fought in many battles during the Heresy. Likewise, the Night Lords weren't exactly the most helpful, and they did get their assholes pounded time and time again. However, delaying the Dark Angels for so long did amazing things for the Traitors, so that leaves us with the Alpha Legion. Despite their numbers, their tactics, their intel, and two Primarchs, they really didn't do much. They didn't kill the Wolves after Prospero, they lost the Primarch at Pluto, whilst also showing Dawn how to better prepare the Sol system, they didn't take part in the Siege of Terra, and they're also absent from almost all major engagements. This is mostly because Alpharis wanted to try actually help fulfill the Emperor's ambitions in his own twisted way, whilst Omegan was high-key a loyalist, so the Alpha Legion was sabotaging itself and not committing itself the way Horus needed them to. If anything, the Alpha Legion were more of a loyalist asset than a traitor one. If you enjoyed the video and you want to support the channel, then pick up the Fallen Angel of Blood, an insanely awesome major mini release coming in 4 different scales, only around for 1 week. Hit the subscribe button and hit the real subscribe button for more useless content. Join the Discord for more memes and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.